The conference room was electric with tension. Elijah Carter, the quiet man from the logistics department, had just said the one thing no one else dared to utter.
Let me put it plainly,
Elijah said, his calm voice slicing through the room. Your expansion strategy is reckless. You're overloading departments that are already on the verge of collapse. And if it fails, when it fails, it won't be the employees who pay the price. It'll be you. The words landed like a thunderclap. Victor Morgan, the head of operations, shot up from his chair, his face flushed with disbelief.
Who do you think you are?
He demanded, his tone laced with disdain.
You're a logistics worker. This is a strategy session, not a suggestion box.
Elijah didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his gaze steady.
I'm someone who sees what you don't. A system on the brink of breaking because you're too far removed to notice.
The room fell silent. Eyes darted between Elijah and Victor, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. For weeks, Elijah had been a shadow in the background, quietly observing. Now, in one moment, he had commanded the room and shattered its fragile hierarchy. What no one knew was that Elijah wasn't just any employee. He was a man on a mission, entrusted by Charles Thornton himself to fix what no one else could see. This meeting was only the beginning. Have you ever found yourself in a moment where everything you believed was tested? A moment where you had to choose between staying silent or standing up for what was right, no matter the cost? Elijah Carter's story reminds us that courage isn't always loud. It's often quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal. In our own lives, we've all faced challenges that pushed us to grow, to question the status quo, and to fight for something bigger than ourselves. What about you? Have you ever spoken up when it mattered most? Or faced a situation where doing the right thing came at a price? We'd love to hear your story. Share your experiences in the comments below, because every voice matters, just like Elijah's. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Together, let's celebrate the moments of quiet strength that shape who we are. Stay with us. Elijah's journey is far from over, and what comes next will change everything. The sharp click of Elijah Carter's polished shoes echoed against the marble floors of Whitman Enterprises. The towering glass skyscraper stood like a monument to success, its mirrored facade shimmering in the morning light. To any passerby, it was just another workday at one of the city's most prestigious companies. To Elijah, it was the beginning of a carefully planned journey, a mission that demanded precision, discretion, and unflinching resolve. Elijah adjusted his plain gray tie, the fabric rough between his fingers. The outfit, a simple, unremarkable suit, was far from his usual tailored wardrobe, but it was perfect for his new role. For the next few months, he wasn't a celebrated strategist or a trusted advisor to corporate titans. He was just Elijah Carter, an entry-level logistics worker with an unassuming badge and a quiet demeanor. The young receptionist barely looked up as she handed him a visitor's pass. "Third floor, logistics department," she muttered, typing away on her keyboard. Elijah offered a polite nod, tucking the badge into his pocket. He was invisible here, just as planned. The elevator ride felt interminable. Elijah's reflection in the sleek silver doors stared back at him. A man who had sat in countless boardrooms, closed multi-million-dollar deals, and devised strategies that saved entire companies. Yet, here he was, standing in the belly of the beast to uncover a truth that charts and reports could never reveal. Charles Thornton's words echoed in his mind. "This company has a heart, Elijah, but it's fading. I need you to see what's really going on, to find what I've lost." The doors slid open with a soft chime, and Elijah stepped into the logistics floor, a stark contrast to the gleaming lobby. Rows of cubicles stretched out like a maze, the air thick with the hum of printers, clicking keyboards, and the faint murmur of hushed conversations. "Hey, you must be the new guy," a gruff voice called out. Elijah turned to see Randall Harris, the department manager. The man's tie was askew, and his shirt strained at the buttons. His smile was wide, but his eyes held no warmth, only the practiced charm of someone who relished control. "Name's Randall," he said, offering a hand that Elijah noted was more gesture than invitation. "Stick with me, and you might just survive this place." Elijah shook his hand firmly. "Thanks, Randall. I'm sure I'll learn a lot from you." The words were neutral, almost bland. Yet, as Elijah released his grip, He caught the faint twitch in Randall's jaw, a telltale sign of unease. People like Randall thrived on dominance, and someone like Elijah, with his quiet confidence, was bound to unsettle him. Elijah found his assigned cubicle at the far end of the room. Beige walls, a worn desk, and a sluggish computer greeted him. He settled in, methodically arranging his things while observing the activity around him. Conversations floated by, complaints about impossible deadlines, jokes that barely masked frustrations, and, every so often, the sharp bark of Randall asserting his dominance. A soft knock on his desk jolted him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Danielle Brooks, a logistics officer whose vibrant energy seemed out of place in the drab surroundings. "Hi, I'm Danielle," she said, extending a hand. "Welcome to logistics, the department they forget about until something goes wrong." Elijah smiled, shaking her hand. "Elijah, thanks for the warm welcome." Danielle glanced at Randall, who was berating a junior employee near the copy machine, before lowering her voice. "Word of advice? Keep your head down and do the bare minimum. It's easier that way." Elijah's smile didn't falter, but inwardly her words landed hard. Charles had been right. There was a sickness in this place, a culture of fear and disconnection that no profit margin could hide. The day dragged on, but Elijah remained vigilant. He listened to the whispered grievances in the break room, watched Randall take credit for the team's efforts, and noticed how Danielle's vibrant spirit dimmed with each passing hour. By the time the clock struck 5, he had filled pages of his notebook with observations. Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the room emptied around him. His mission was clear now, sharper than ever. This wasn't just about fixing a company. It was about giving a voice to people like Danielle, exposing men like Randall, and proving that no skyscraper was too tall to crumble under the weight of neglect. He tucked the notebook into his bag and walked out into the cool evening air. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Elijah arrived early, his steps purposeful, as he navigated the still quiet office. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound as he sat down at his desk and powered on the sluggish computer. The logistics floor, devoid of its usual chaos, felt oddly tranquil. Elijah relished the quiet, using the time to review the operations data he had discreetly pulled from the company's system. The numbers told a story of inefficiency, mismanaged shipments, unnecessary delays, and overworked staff. It was all there, hidden beneath layers of polished reports that painted a rosier picture for the executives upstairs. Elijah's sharp eye for patterns pieced together what the numbers couldn't say outright. The cracks in Whitman Enterprises ran deeper than he had imagined. The tranquility shattered as the office began to fill. Elijah's observations resumed, noting how Randall's loud presence dominated the room like clockwork. He barked orders at one employee while heaped undeserved praise on another. Randall's strategy was clear: divide and conquer. Keep people too busy competing to realize they were being exploited. Then came the moment Elijah had been waiting for. "Johnson!" Randall's voice boomed, drawing everyone's attention. Elijah turned calmly as Randall approached, waving a stack of papers in one hand, like a flag of authority. "We've got a shipment mix-up with a major supplier," Randall announced, his tone just shy of accusatory. "Fix it by noon, and don't screw this up. It's one of our biggest clients." Elijah took the papers, scanning them quickly. The error was glaring, a simple routing issue that could have been avoided with proper oversight. But he noticed something else, a pattern. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was part of a broader issue in the department's processes. "Understood," Elijah replied evenly. "I'll get it resolved." Randall leaned closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. "Good. You might want to work fast. I'd hate to see someone new stumble so soon." Elijah's calm didn't waver. "I appreciate the advice." Randall straightened, his smirk faltering slightly at the lack of reaction. He turned and walked away, barking at someone else before retreating to his office. Elijah wasted no time. He dove into the system, analyzing the shipment data and cross-referencing supplier logs. The solution was straightforward, but Elijah wasn't just interested in fixing the immediate problem. He wanted to understand why it had happened, and how to prevent it from happening again. As he worked, a voice interrupted him. "Need a hand?" Danielle stood beside his desk, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "I've got it under control," Elijah said with a small smile, but Danielle lingered. I saw the way Randall threw that at you, she said, glancing toward the manager's office. He does this all the time, sets people up to fail so he can swoop in and save the day. Elijah's gaze followed hers. Noted, thanks for the heads up. Danielle hesitated before pulling up a chair. Look, if you're new to this place, you should know something. People like Randall thrive here because they make everyone else afraid to speak up. If you challenge him too much, she trailed off, her meaning clear. Elijah met her eyes, his voice steady. Sometimes, silence lets the wrong people stay in power, don't you think? Danielle blinked, her expression shifting from caution to thoughtfulness. After a moment, she nodded. You're not like the others, are you? Elijah smiled faintly but didn't answer. By noon, Elijah had resolved the shipment issue and drafted a revised workflow that would prevent similar errors in the future. He printed out his findings and walked them to Randall's office. Randall barely glanced up from his desk as Elijah entered. Is it fixed? He asked, his tone dismissive. Yes, Elijah replied, setting the report down in front of him. And I've outlined a process improvement plan that should eliminate these kinds of errors moving forward. Randall finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the report. He didn't like what he saw, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. Elijah's thoroughness left no room for Randall's usual excuses or theatrics. Don't overstep, Johnson, Randall said finally, his tone sharp. Just do your job. Elijah nodded, unfazed. Of course. Let me know if you need further assistance. He turned and walked out, feeling the weight of Randall's glare on his back. But Elijah wasn't intimidated. If anything, Randall's hostility only confirmed what Elijah already knew. This company needed a new kind of leadership, one that didn't thrive on fear and manipulation. As the day wound down, Elijah found himself in the break room, grabbing a cup of coffee. Danielle joined him a few minutes later, her expression lighter than it had been earlier. Heard you fixed the shipment issue, she said. Nicely done. Thanks, Elijah replied. Danielle paused, then asked, You really believe this place can change, don't you? Elijah considered her question, his gaze steady. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Danielle smiled faintly, her posture relaxing. Well, for what it's worth, I hope you're right. Elijah nodded. So do I. The day started like any other. Elijah Carter walked into the logistics department with his usual calm demeanor, greeted with the muffled hum of printers and hurried footsteps. The team was immersed in their routines, heads down and voices low. Elijah had almost grown accustomed to the subdued energy, a quiet resignation that hung in the air like fog. He was halfway through reviewing inventory reports when an unexpected email pinged into his inbox. The subject line was short and sharp. 10:30 a.m. strategy session, attendance required. Elijah's eyebrows arched as he opened it. The email was from Victor Morgan, the head of operations, a man notorious for his ruthless approach to management. The invite list read like a who's who of Whitman Enterprises' executive suite. This wasn't a meeting for someone in logistics. The mistake seemed obvious, but Elijah's instincts told him otherwise. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. What's that? Danielle asked as she walked by, catching his uncharacteristic stillness. A meeting invitation, Elijah replied, the corners of his mouth curving slightly. Looks like I'm headed to the big leagues. Danielle leaned over his shoulder and read the email. You're kidding. What would they want with someone from logistics? That's what I intend to find out, Elijah said, his tone as neutral as ever, but his mind already working. At 10:25 a.m., Elijah adjusted his tie and made his way to the executive floor. The air was different here, crisper, colder, and laced with a tension he could almost taste. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a hallway lined with portraits of past CEOs, their gazes stern and unyielding. Elijah's footsteps echoed as he approached the boardroom, its doors a gleaming barrier to the inner sanctum of power. He paused for a moment, centering himself. This was the first real test of his mission, a chance to observe the leadership in their natural habitat. As he stepped inside, conversation ceased. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward him, their expressions a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and mild annoyance. Victor Morgan, seated at the head of the table, was the first to break the silence. You're Carter, right? Logistics? That's correct, Elijah replied evenly, meeting Victor's sharp gaze. Victor smirked. Well, this meeting might be a little above your pay grade, but since you're here, feel free to take a seat. Try not to get lost. A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Elijah remained unfazed. He walked to the far end of the table, his movements deliberate and controlled. The meeting began with Victor leading a presentation on the company's aggressive expansion strategy. Slides flashed across the screen, profit projections, new market opportunities, and bold timelines. It was an impressive display, but as Elijah studied the content, his practiced eye caught the flaws. The logistics department was at the heart of the expansion plan, expected to bear the brunt of the increased workload with no additional resources. It was a recipe for disaster, and Elijah knew it. Questions? Victor asked, his tone almost daring anyone to challenge him. Elijah glanced around the room. Most of the executives nodded in approval, their expressions smug and satisfied. No one seemed willing to address the glaring issues. He raised his hand. Victor blinked, caught off guard. Yes. Carter, was it? Elijah leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. You're proposing a 30% increase in operational output without any additional staffing or infrastructure upgrades. How do you plan to maintain efficiency without overwhelming the existing teams? The room fell silent. Victor's smirk faltered for the first time. Well, Victor began, his tone dripping with condescension, that's why we hire talented people, to find solutions. We don't throw money at problems. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. With respect, this isn't about money. It's about sustainability. Overworked teams make mistakes, and in logistics, a small mistake can snowball into major delays. That kind of ripple effect could cost the company more than any staffing adjustment. Victor's face darkened. Are you suggesting we can't handle the workload? I'm suggesting we need to address potential bottlenecks before they happen, Elijah said, his tone calm but unyielding. A low murmur spread through the room. Elijah could feel the weight of their stares, some appraising, others resentful. But he didn't care. His job wasn't to make friends, it was to uncover the truth. The murmur in the boardroom lingered as Victor Morgan's expression hardened. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and fixed Elijah with a pointed stare. I appreciate your perspective, Carter, Victor said, his voice clipped. But the executives in this room have decades of experience managing these strategies. Logistics is your domain. Perhaps you should focus on handling your department before critiquing decisions made at a higher level. The tension in the room was palpable. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances, while others leaned back in their chairs, waiting to see how Elijah would respond. Elijah folded his hands on the table, his expression steady. Respectfully, Mr. Morgan, logistics is my domain, which is exactly why I'm raising these concerns. My team will be directly affected by these changes, and if they fail, the entire strategy fails. Victor's jaw tightened, but before he could retort, another voice cut through the tension. I think Carter has a point, Catherine Moore said, her tone measured and deliberate. All heads turned toward her. The chief marketing officer was one of the few women at the table, known for her sharp intellect and willingness to challenge authority when necessary. Catherine gestured toward the presentation slides. Victor, your plan is ambitious, but if we're pushing logistics and operations to their limits without support, it could undermine everything. Maybe we should reevaluate the resource allocation. Victor looked visibly annoyed. Catherine, with all due respect, this plan has been thoroughly vetted. And yet, Catherine interrupted, Carter's raised a valid point. Shouldn't we be considering potential risks before they become problems? Elijah remained quiet, watching the power dynamics unfold. Catherine's interjection was unexpected, but it reinforced the growing divide within the leadership team, a divide that Elijah intended to exploit. Victor forced a thin smile. We'll take it under advisement, he said dismissively, signaling the end of the discussion. As the meeting progressed, Elijah took detailed mental notes. The room wasn't just filled with strategies and projections. It was filled with egos, insecurities, and unspoken alliances. When the meeting finally ended, the executives filtered out, some lingering to exchange hushed remarks. Elijah gathered his notebook and was preparing to leave when Catherine approached him. You've got guts, she said, her voice low but laced with curiosity. Most people in your position would have kept quiet. Elijah offered a polite smile. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, just offering a perspective they might have missed. Catherine raised an eyebrow. You did more than that. You made them uncomfortable. And trust me, that's not easy to do in this room. Elijah studied her for a moment. Catherine wasn't just curious, she was testing him, trying to understand his motives. Sometimes discomfort is necessary, Elijah said simply. It's how we grow. She smiled faintly, but there was an edge to it. Just be careful, Carter. People here don't like being challenged, especially by someone they underestimate. I'll keep that in mind, Elijah replied, his tone steady. Back on the logistics floor, Elijah returned to his desk. The meeting had provided invaluable insights, not just into the company's flawed strategy, but into the players involved. Catherine's subtle support had been unexpected, but it opened a door. She was pragmatic, a potential ally, and someone who clearly valued results over politics. Later that afternoon, Danielle approached him with an expression that bordered on incredulous. I heard about the meeting, she said, lowering her voice. You actually called out Victor Morgan in front of the whole executive team? Elijah chuckled softly. News travels fast around here. You've got guts, I'll give you that, Danielle said, shaking her head. But be careful. Randall and his cronies won't like you stepping out of line. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Let them watch. I'm not here to play their game. I'm here to fix what's broken. Danielle studied him for a moment, her expression softening. You really think this place can change? I know it can, Elijah said firmly. The question is whether the people in charge are willing to let it. As the day ended, Elijah sat alone at his desk, the faint hum of the office fading as employees trickled out. His mind replayed the events of the day. The tension in the boardroom, Victor's thinly veiled hostility, and Catherine's unexpected support. This was just the beginning. The power dynamics were shifting, and Elijah knew that every move he made from here on out would be under scrutiny. But that didn't deter him. Elijah's mission wasn't about fitting in or playing it safe. It was about dismantling the toxic systems that stifled innovation and crushed potential. He had seen the cracks in the foundation, and now it was time to rebuild. Brick by brick, step by step. As he gathered his things and walked out into the night, Elijah felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance, but he wasn't afraid. Change was coming to Whitman Enterprises, and Elijah Carter was the one leading the charge. The morning after the executive meeting, Elijah Carter walked into the logistics floor to an unexpected stillness. Conversations that usually buzzed around the workspace seemed hushed, replaced by side glances and whispered speculations. Something was different. Elijah could feel it in the air, like the moments before a storm. Danielle approached him, her face taut with concern. You're the talk of the building, she whispered, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be listening. Let me guess, Elijah said calmly. Not everyone's a fan. She hesitated, then nodded. Victor's been in meetings all morning. Word is he's rallying his allies. You stirred the pot, Elijah. Elijah offered a faint smile. Good. A pot left unstirred just collects mold. Danielle stared at him for a moment, then shook her head with a mix of admiration and worry. Just watch your back. These people don't play fair. Elijah didn't respond immediately, his thoughts already shifting to the challenges ahead. He had known the fallout from the meeting would be swift, but this level of unease wasn't entirely unexpected. Change always threatened those who thrived in stagnant waters. By mid-morning, Elijah found himself summoned to the office of Andrew Greer, the company's head of human resources. The request was curt, the tone unmistakably formal. Elijah walked into the spacious, sterile office to find Greer seated behind his oversized desk, flanked by two senior managers from operations. Carter, Greer began, his tone clipped. Thank you for coming. Elijah nodded, taking the seat they gestured toward. Of course. What's this about? Greer folded his hands, his expression carefully neutral. There have been concerns raised following yesterday's meeting. Some of your comments have been perceived as undermining the leadership team's strategy. Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. Undermining or questioning, there's a difference. The room grew tense. One of the managers shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Greer didn't waver. This company values collaboration, Greer continued, but it also values respect for the chain of command. You're new here, Carter. It's important to understand how things operate. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but laced with authority. I understand how things operate, Mr. Greer. That's why I raised my concerns. Ignoring logistical limitations isn't just an oversight, it's a risk to the company's future. If raising that point makes people uncomfortable, then maybe it's time to rethink what collaboration actually means. The room fell silent, Greer's carefully constructed facade momentarily slipping. "You're walking a fine line, Carter," Greer said finally, his tone cold. "Consider this a friendly reminder to tread carefully." Elijah stood, his movements deliberate and composed. "I appreciate the reminder, Mr. Greer, but if the fine line is between doing what's easy and doing what's right, I know which side I'll stand on." As he walked out of the office, Elijah felt the weight of their stares on his back. The walls of resistance were growing taller, but he wasn't about to back down. Later that afternoon, Elijah returned to his desk to find Sarah waiting for him, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Rumors are flying," she said as he sat down. "They're saying you're on thin ice." Elijah chuckled softly. "Thin ice is where the best skaters shine." Her brow furrowed. "This isn't a joke, Elijah. They're gunning for you." "I know," he said, his tone serious now. "But that just means I'm getting close to the truth. People don't fight this hard unless they've got something to protect." Sarah hesitated, then leaned in closer. "There's something you should know. Gary's been talking to Victor. I overheard them in the break room this morning. They think you're a threat." Elijah's expression hardened. "Good. Let them." Elijah leaned back in his chair, the weight of Sarah's words settling over him. Gary and Victor, a toxic alliance of fear and self-preservation, weren't just aiming to protect their positions, they were gearing up to push him out. This wasn't a battle they wanted to win on merit. It was a fight to silence him before he could disrupt their carefully built kingdom. He glanced around the logistics floor, taking in the quiet determination of his team. These were the people who bore the brunt of decisions made far above their pay grade, the ones who were expected to turn grand strategies into reality with little to no resources. Elijah wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for them. By evening, Elijah had begun formulating a plan. It wasn't just about defending himself, it was about exposing the rot at Whitman Enterprises. He needed to act strategically, not impulsively, and to do that, he needed leverage. The next morning, Elijah arrived early, long before the usual hum of the office began. He wasn't just there to get a head start on his day, he was digging. Using the company's internal systems, he combed through logistics reports, financial data, and operational metrics. Patterns began to emerge, delayed shipments that mysteriously went unreported, contracts with vendors that seemed suspiciously overpriced. It was subtle, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, but Elijah's experienced eye caught it. Someone was profiting off the inefficiencies, and it didn't take a genius to guess who. As he pieced together the puzzle, a shadow loomed over his desk. He looked up to find Danielle staring at his screen, her arms crossed. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Connecting dots," Elijah replied. Danielle pulled up a chair, leaning in closer. "And those dots lead to..." Elijah hesitated, then sighed. "I think Gary and Victor have been covering for each other. There's something off about the way operations and logistics have been run. I'm just trying to figure out what." Danielle's eyes widened. "That's risky. If they find out..." "They won't," Elijah interrupted, his voice firm. "Not until I'm ready to show my hand." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Just be careful. If you're right, they won't go down without a fight." Later that day, Elijah's opportunity came. Gary stormed into the logistics department, his face flushed with anger. "Carter!" he barked, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "A shipment for one of our biggest clients is delayed. Care to explain how you've managed to screw this up?" Elijah stood slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "The delay wasn't caused by logistics," he said evenly. "The issue lies with operations. The vendor approvals weren't processed in time." Gary's eyes narrowed. "Don't shift the blame. It's your department's job to make sure these things run smoothly." "And it's your department's job to provide the resources we need to do that," Elijah countered, his voice steady but edged with steel. The room went silent. All eyes were on them now, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Gary leaned in closer, his voice low but venomous. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carter." Elijah didn't flinch. "The truth is only dangerous to those who fear it." For a moment, Gary said nothing, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out, leaving behind a silence that buzzed with unspoken questions. That evening, Elijah met with Sarah and Danielle in the break room. He had shared just enough of his findings to bring them into his circle of trust, knowing their insight could be invaluable. "This goes deeper than I thought," Elijah admitted, his voice low. "Gary and Victor have been using the system to cover their tracks. They're not just protecting their positions, they're profiting from the chaos." Danielle's jaw tightened. "So, what do? "We keep digging," Elijah said. "If we can prove what they're doing, we won't just expose them. We'll force the company to change." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm in, whatever it takes." Elijah looked at the two of them, his allies in a battle that was just beginning. "This isn't going to be easy," he said quietly, "but if we want a company that values its people over politics, it's a fight worth having." As Elijah walked out into the cool night air, he felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing on his shoulders. The resistance he faced wasn't just about him. It was about a culture that rewarded corruption and crushed potential. But Elijah wasn't backing down. The shadows of resistance loomed large, but he was ready to shine a light on them. Whitman Enterprises would change, and Elijah Carter would make sure of it, no matter the cost. The boardroom was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Elijah Carter stood at the far end of the long table, his calm demeanor betraying none of the turbulence that churned within. In front of him sat the company's most powerful figures, board members, department heads, and the handful of executives who dictated Whitman Enterprises' direction. The stakes were clear. Today was not just a meeting, it was a reckoning. The previous night, Elijah had worked tirelessly, piecing together every shred of evidence he had unearthed about Gary and Victor's underhanded dealings. It was all there: emails, discrepancies in financial records, vendor contracts that defied explanation. He knew this wasn't just a matter of exposing corruption. It was about shattering the facade that had kept the company stagnant for years. "Thank you all for being here," Elijah began, his voice steady but resonant. "I won't take up much of your time, but I do have something urgent to address. It concerns the integrity of this company and the trust we place in those who lead it." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Victor, seated near the middle of the table, leaned back in his chair, his expression one of forced nonchalance. Gary, however, glared at Elijah with thinly veiled contempt, his jaw tightening as though bracing for impact. Elijah pressed a button on the small remote in his hand, and a presentation illuminated the screen behind him. "These documents," he said, gesturing to the first slide, "highlight irregularities in vendor agreements from the past 2 years. Specifically, a series of payments to suppliers whose services were never rendered, totaling over $500,000. Further analysis shows these payments were approved under the supervision of operations and finance." The room went still. Eyes darted from the screen to Victor and Gary, whose expressions now betrayed cracks in their composure. "I'm not here to accuse anyone without evidence," Elijah continued, "so I'll let the facts speak for themselves." He clicked to the next slide, which displayed emails exchanged between Gary and Victor. The messages were damning: plans to funnel funds, cover mistakes, and silence dissenting voices. The room erupted into murmurs, a cacophony of disbelief and fury. Victor shot to his feet, his voice sharp and defensive. "This is outrageous! These are private communications, Carter. You've crossed a line." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. The line was crossed when company resources were exploited for personal gain. The data doesn't lie, Victor. The question now is whether you'll own up to it or dig yourself deeper. Gary's face turned crimson. "This is a witch hunt. You're just trying to climb the ladder by tearing others down. Everyone here knows your game." Elijah stepped closer to the table, his voice calm but cutting. "What I'm trying to do is clean up a company that's been held back by people who put their interests above its mission. This isn't about me. It's about the employees who show up every day and give their best, while others undermine their work from the shadows." For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the board members, an older woman named Eleanor, broke the silence. "Elijah," she said, her voice steady, "these are serious allegations. Do you have any recommendations on how we move forward?" Elijah nodded, meeting her gaze. "I do, but it starts with holding those responsible accountable." The tension in the boardroom was palpable. Gary and Victor exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of panic and defiance. Eleanor, the board member who had spoken moments ago, leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning the faces around the table. "Elijah," she said slowly, "accountability is critical, but this is a deeply rooted issue. How do we ensure this kind of behavior doesn't happen again?" Elijah's response came without hesitation. "It starts with transparency. Whitman Enterprises needs a cultural overhaul. The current system fosters division, rewards complacency, and allows power to be concentrated in ways that escape scrutiny. That ends today." He turned back to the presentation, clicking to a slide titled "The Path Forward." "First, I propose an immediate audit of all vendor contracts, facilitated by an external firm. We need unbiased oversight to rebuild trust. Second, we restructure leadership to reflect accountability, innovation, and collaboration. And third," he paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in, "we rebuild trust with our employees by giving them a voice in decisions that directly affect their work." Victor leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And let me guess, you see yourself leading this rebuild?" Elijah met his gaze evenly. "I see myself as someone willing to do what's necessary to put the company back on course. If that makes me a leader, then so be it." The room buzzed with whispers, and Eleanor raised her hand to quiet them. "These are bold steps, Elijah, but boldness doesn't guarantee results. How do you propose to handle the resistance this will inevitably create?" Elijah glanced around the room, letting the weight of her question settle before answering. "Resistance is expected, but it won't stop progress. I've already begun working directly with employees at every level. The more we align our actions with our principles, the less room there will be for resistance to take hold." As he spoke, a surprising voice cut in. Sarah. She had been standing at the back of the room, silently observing, but now her words rang clear and confident. "Elijah's right," she said, stepping forward. "As someone who's worked on the front lines, I've seen how much potential this company has. But that potential is wasted when people like Gary and Victor prioritize their own agendas. Employees want to believe in this company again, but they need to see real change." The room shifted as Sarah's presence added an unexpected layer of authenticity. Elijah nodded at her, gratitude flickering across his face. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "This is a lot to take in, but it's clear something must be done. I suggest we vote on Elijah's recommendations and decide on the next steps." Victor slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. We're being blindsided by baseless accusations and power plays." Eleanor's voice was firm. "If you have a defense, Victor, now's the time to present it." Victor faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he grasped for a response. The damning evidence Elijah had laid out was impossible to refute. "Then it's settled," Eleanor said, her tone leaving no room for debate. "The audit will commence immediately, and any findings will determine further actions, including disciplinary measures for those implicated." Gary's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as reality set in. Victor, still fuming, rose from his seat and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah felt a mix of relief and resolve. The hardest battles lay ahead, but this was a pivotal victory. Sarah approached him, her expression a blend of admiration and determination. "You didn't just stand up to them, you changed the conversation. People are finally seeing what this company could be." Elijah offered her a faint smile. "It's a start, but we're far from done. Now the real work begins." That night, Elijah stayed late in his office, poring over the details of the next steps. As the city lights flickered outside his window, he couldn't help but feel the magnitude of the moment. Change wasn't just coming, it was here. And for the first time, Whitman Enterprises had a chance to become something truly extraordinary. Elijah Carter stood in the shadows of the massive Whitman Enterprises building, its glass windows reflecting the cold twilight of the city. Inside those walls, a storm was brewing, a storm he had unleashed. He had spent weeks piecing together the puzzle of Gary and Victor's corruption, and now the evidence was undeniable. But tonight, it wasn't the spreadsheets or emails that haunted him. It was the faces of the people whose lives were being quietly crushed by the system's rot. The thought of Sarah, her voice steady but laced with frustration as she talked about feeling unseen, flashed in his mind. Then Danielle's quiet warning echoed, "Be careful, Elijah. These people don't lose without a fight." But there was no turning back. Whitman Enterprises wasn't just a corporation to Elijah. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in corporate America. Power hoarded at the top, talent squandered, and those who dared to speak up, silenced. He couldn't let it continue, not while he still had breath in his body. The next morning, Elijah entered the logistics department with purpose. The team was bustling, heads bent over schedules and shipping manifests, but the air was thick with tension. News of Gary's recent outburst had spread, and everyone knew it wasn't just another bad day at the office. It was a power struggle, one that could have ripple effects for everyone. Sarah approached Elijah as he set his bag down at his desk. Her expression was a mix of determination and unease. "They've called a meeting," she said in a low voice. "Victor's heading it, and Gary's pushing to have you reassigned. They're saying you're disruptive." Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but sharp. "Disruptive? That's one way to describe exposing incompetence." Sarah hesitated, then leaned in closer. "You're not scared?" Elijah looked her in the eye. "Of course I'm scared, but fear isn't a reason to stop. It's a reason to keep going." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "Then I'm with you. Whatever happens, I'm not letting them push you out without a fight." The meeting was held in one of the larger conference rooms on the executive floor, a space Elijah had only visited once before. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension as Elijah walked in. Gary was seated at the head of the table, flanked by Victor and a handful of department heads who had likely been handpicked to back them. "Ah, Carter," Gary said, his tone laced with condescension. "How good of you to join us." Elijah took a seat near the far end of the table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. He didn't miss the smug glances exchanged between Gary and Victor, nor the uneasy fidgeting of some of the other attendees. Victor cleared his throat, adopting a tone of feigned authority. "This meeting is about maintaining order and ensuring that our departments are aligned. Recently, there have been concerns raised about certain individuals undermining that order." Elijah knew exactly where this was headed, but he said nothing, letting them come to him. Gary leaned forward, his expression smug. "Carter, your actions have caused a significant amount of disruption in the logistics department, questioning leadership, bypassing proper channels, and, frankly, creating a hostile work environment. These aren't the qualities of a team player." Elijah held his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "And covering up logistical failures, manipulating vendor contracts, and profiting off inefficiencies, are those the qualities of leadership?" The room fell into stunned silence. Gary's face turned a shade of crimson that could rival a stop sign. "You're out of line," Gary bellowed, slamming his hand on the table. Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly pulled a folder from his bag and placed it on the table. "This is a full audit of the past 6 months, shipment delays, inflated vendor contracts, and internal emails. All of it leads back to you and Victor. I've already forwarded it to the compliance department and copied senior leadership." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Gary stared at the folder as if it were a coiled snake ready to strike. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the color draining from his face. The other department heads exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do or say. Finally, Gary scoffed, though his voice betrayed a quiver of uncertainty. "This is nothing but speculation, fabricated nonsense by someone trying to deflect blame." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Then, let's let the compliance team decide, shall we? I'm sure they'll be more than capable of determining what's fabricated and what isn't." Victor, who had been silent up until now, finally found his voice. "Even if there are irregularities, they don't justify your insubordination. You've overstepped your role, Carter. You're just a logistics employee, not an investigator." Elijah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're right. I'm a logistics employee, and yet, I seem to be the only one in this room who's interested in holding people accountable. So, what does that say about the rest of you?" A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the department heads looked down, avoiding eye contact, while others frowned, their unease growing. It was clear that Elijah had struck a nerve. Gary slammed his palm against the table again, his voice rising. "This is a waste of time. We're here to address your behavior, Carter, not to entertain baseless accusations." Elijah sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'm happy to address my behavior. Let's talk about how I've exposed inefficiencies, suggested cost-saving measures, and resolved shipment crises that others failed to handle. If that's disruptive, then maybe disruption is exactly what this company needs. The meeting ended abruptly, with Gary storming out, followed closely by Victor. The remaining department heads lingered, exchanging hushed whispers before quietly filing out. Sarah and Danielle were waiting outside the conference room, their expressions a mix of anxiety and anticipation. "Well?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's out of my hands now. Compliance has the evidence. Gary and Victor won't be able to cover this up." Danielle frowned, her brow furrowed. "You think they'll retaliate?" Elijah gave a small nod. "They'll try, but this isn't about me anymore. It's about changing the culture of this company, and that means shining a light on the people who've been exploiting it for their own gain." The fallout began almost immediately. By the end of the week, an internal investigation was underway, and whispers of Gary and Victor's misconduct spread like wildfire. Employees who had once stayed silent now began to speak up, emboldened by Elijah's actions. But the resistance wasn't over. Gary wasn't the type to go down quietly. One afternoon, as Elijah was heading to the break room, he found Gary waiting for him in the hallway. His posture was stiff, his jaw set, and his eyes burning with a mix of rage and desperation. "You think you've won, Carter?" Gary hissed, stepping closer. "You have no idea what you've just done." Elijah didn't back down. He met Gary's gaze head-on, his voice calm but firm. "What I've done is hold you accountable. If that scares you, maybe you should ask yourself why." Gary's lips curled into a sneer. "You'll regret this. People like you always do." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Maybe, but even if I do, it'll be worth it." By the end of the week, the investigation reached its first major milestone. Gary and Victor were placed on administrative leave pending further review. The news sent shockwaves through the company, and for the first time, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. In the break room, Sarah and Danielle approached him, their expressions a mix of relief and admiration. "You did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Elijah shook his head. "We did it. This wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. And it's not over yet. There's still a lot of work to do." Danielle smiled. "But it's a start. And for once, it feels like things are actually going to change." Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Change isn't easy, but it's worth fighting for. And this fight isn't over." As he looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had stood by him, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The breaking point had come and gone, but the road ahead was clear. It was time to rebuild Whitman Enterprises, one step at a time. The office buzzed with whispers as news of Gary and Victor's suspension spread. Whitman Enterprises had long been a fortress of rigid hierarchy, where the misconduct of those at the top was rarely challenged. But now, a crack had appeared, and it was widening with each passing day. Elijah stood in the break room, watching as small groups of employees huddled together, their conversations animated but cautious. He wasn't eavesdropping, but snippets of their words floated to him nonetheless. "Do you think they'll fire them? I heard Carter was the one who exposed them. This could be the start of something big." He exhaled slowly, his fingers curling around the warm ceramic of his coffee mug. The weight of what he'd set in motion pressed against his chest, equal parts exhilaration and dread. It wasn't just about Gary and Victor, it was about dismantling a culture that had allowed them to thrive. And Elijah knew that culture didn't change overnight. As he turned to leave, Sarah caught his arm. Her eyes sparkled with determination, a stark contrast to the trepidation that had lingered there weeks before. "You've started something, Elijah," she said softly. "But you know this isn't the end, right?" He smiled, the edges of it tinged with exhaustion. "I know. It's just the beginning." Later that day, Elijah was summoned to a meeting with Richard Whitman. The message had been terse, but Elijah could read between the lines. Richard had been closely monitoring the situation, and now he wanted answers. The executive floor was as silent as ever, the faint click of Elijah's polished shoes, the only sound as he made his way to Richard's office. When he entered, he found Richard standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretching out before him like a kingdom. "Elijah," Richard said, his voice warm but weighted, Come in. Close the door. Elijah obeyed, taking a seat across from the older man's desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension in the room thick but not hostile. "I've been watching," Richard finally said, his gaze still fixed on the skyline. "Watching you, watching the company. You've stirred up quite the storm." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "A storm was needed, Richard. You know that." Richard turned then, his expression inscrutable. "I do. And you've handled it better than most would have. But now, we're at a crossroads. What happens next will determine the future of this company, and yours." Elijah nodded, his mind already racing. He knew what Richard was really asking. "Are you ready to lead?" "I've spent months learning this company from the inside out," Elijah began, his voice steady but passionate. "I've seen its flaws, its strengths, and its untapped potential. And I've seen the people, the ones who've been overlooked, undervalued, and silenced. If we're going to rebuild, we have to start with them." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressing into a thoughtful line. "And what about the ones resisting change? The ones clinging to the old ways?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "We show them the door. This company can't move forward if it's weighed down by those who refuse to adapt." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Good. That's what I needed to hear." As Elijah left the office, a sense of clarity settled over him. The road ahead was steep, but for the first time, he felt certain of his footing. The following morning, Elijah made his way to the logistics department. The investigation had rattled many employees, and while he felt the winds of change were shifting in their favor, he knew that fear and uncertainty were still pervasive. This wasn't just about rooting out corruption. It was about rebuilding trust. As he stepped onto the bustling floor, a hush fell over the room. Workers paused mid-task, their eyes darting between him and each other. Elijah met their stares with a calm, reassuring smile, making his way to the center of the open space. "I know you're all busy," he began, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. "But I wanted to take a moment to talk, to all of you, not just as colleagues, but as the backbone of this company." The room grew quieter still. Even Gary's former allies, now reduced to uneasy silence, couldn't resist leaning in to listen. "For years, Whitman Enterprises has relied on you, on your hard work, your dedication, your problem solving, and for years, that work has been overlooked. That stops now." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Elijah took a step forward, his tone becoming more personal. "When I joined this department, I didn't come in as an outsider trying to fix things from above. I came in to understand what this company truly needed. And what I found was talent, innovation, and resilience, all buried under a system that didn't value them. Well, I'm here to tell you, I see you, I hear you, and I'm not the only one." Sarah, standing near the back, crossed her arms but nodded in quiet agreement. Elijah caught her eye and smiled faintly, drawing strength from her silent support. "This isn't just about getting rid of bad actors like Gary and Victor," Elijah continued, his voice rising. "It's about building something better. A company where your ideas matter, where your contributions are recognized, and where the people who've been in the shadows for too long finally get their moment in the light." The murmur turned into scattered applause. Elijah felt the shift, small, but real. "But I can't do it alone," he added, his tone softening but losing none of its conviction. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours. If we work together, if we refuse to go back to the way things were, then there's nothing we can't achieve." For a moment, the room was still. Then, one by one, hands clapped together. The applause grew louder, swelling into a wave of energy that swept through the space. Elijah felt a knot in his chest loosen, replaced by a glimmer of hope. That afternoon, Elijah gathered his key allies, Sarah, Danielle, and a handful of others who had proven their loyalty, to lay the groundwork for the changes he envisioned. They met in a small, unused conference room, their voices hushed but charged with determination. "We need a plan," Danielle said, leaning forward in her chair. "The investigation will deal with Gary and Victor, but that's just the first step. If we don't start rebuilding now, the momentum will fade." Elijah nodded. "You're right. The investigation bought us time, but we need to act fast. The first priority is empowering people at every level. That means clearer communication, better training, and giving employees a real say in decision-making." "And leadership?" Sarah asked, her tone cautious but firm. "What happens to the people at the top who are still stuck in the old ways?" Elijah met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. They'll have a choice, adapt or leave. But we're not waiting for them to make up their minds. We're moving forward, with or without them. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the group. Then, slowly, Sarah smiled. "I'm in." "Me too," Danielle added. The others echoed their agreement, and Elijah felt a swell of pride. These were the people who would help him rebuild Whitman Enterprises, brick by brick. As the day ended, Elijah returned to his office, exhaustion creeping into his bones. But when he looked out at the city skyline, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. Hope. The winds of change were no longer just blowing. They were roaring. And with the right team by his side, Elijah knew they could weather any storm. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that held its breath before a storm. Elijah stood at the head of the long oak table, his posture commanding but calm. The company's senior leadership had been summoned, along with the board of directors, for what had been billed as a strategic alignment meeting. But everyone in the room knew this was more than that. This was a reckoning. The faces around the table were a study in contrast, some filled with curiosity, others shadowed with suspicion. Among them, Sarah sat near the back, her expression steady, but her hands folded tightly. She wasn't here as a logistics team member anymore. Elijah had brought her to this meeting as a symbol of the change he intended to implement, a direct challenge to the traditional hierarchy that had long ruled Whitman Enterprises. Elijah scanned the room, meeting each gaze in turn. Then, with a quiet exhale, he began. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I called this meeting because we've reached a critical juncture in this company's history. The decisions we make today will define not just the future of Whitman Enterprises, but the legacy we leave behind for everyone who follows." Murmurs rippled through the room, but Elijah raised a hand to silence them. For too long, this company has operated in silos, departments isolated from one another, employees overlooked, and leadership disconnected from the people who make our success possible. That stops now. He paused, letting his words sink in. The murmurs stopped, replaced by a heavy quiet. Even the most skeptical faces in the room seemed compelled to listen. Elijah turned to the large screen behind him, where a slide displayed stark numbers: employee turnover rates, client dissatisfaction trends, and operational inefficiencies. Each figure was a dagger, driving home the urgency of the changes he was proposing. "These numbers," Elijah said, pointing to the screen, "are a reflection of what happens when we prioritize profits over people, hierarchy over innovation, and comfort over accountability. If we continue down this path, we won't just stagnate, we'll collapse." Victor Sterling, one of the longest-serving board members, cleared his throat, his tone dripping with skepticism. "With all due respect, Elijah, Whitman Enterprises has weathered storms before. Our strategies may not be perfect, but they've worked well enough to get us here." Elijah didn't flinch. "Victor, you're right. We've weathered storms, but surviving isn't the same as thriving. And if you think well enough is a strategy for the future, you're not looking at the bigger picture." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Victor opened his mouth to retort, but Elijah pressed on, his voice rising with intensity. "This isn't just about numbers or strategies. It's about people. The Garys and Victors of this company have had their time, but their time has cost us. Cost us talent, trust, and the innovation we need to stay ahead. If we're going to lead, we have to start valuing the people who make leadership possible. That means new voices, new ideas, and yes, new leadership where it's needed." He gestured towards Sarah. "Sarah Carter is here today because she represents the kind of talent this company has ignored for far too long. She's a leader not because of her title, but because of her actions. And she's not the exception. She's the standard we should be holding ourselves to." Sarah's eyes widened, and the room erupted in whispers. Elijah let the noise rise for a moment before raising his hand again. "I know change is hard," he said, his voice softer now, but no less resolute. "I know it's uncomfortable, but we didn't become leaders because we wanted easy. We became leaders because we wanted to make a difference. And now, more than ever, we have the chance to do exactly that." The murmurs in the room had barely subsided when Victor Sterling leaned forward, his tone sharp. "You speak passionately, Elijah, but passion alone doesn't run a company. Tradition, discipline, and experience do. You can't uproot decades of established leadership and expect everything to magically fall into place. Elijah turned to Victor, his eyes steady, his voice calm but unyielding. Victor, you're right. Tradition has its place, but only when it serves progress. Discipline is vital, but not when it stifles innovation. And as for experience, it's valuable, but only when it's paired with humility. The experience that got us here isn't enough to get us where we need to go. The room fell silent again, the weight of Elijah's words pulling at the air. He stepped forward, his hands clasped together as if anchoring himself to the ground. This isn't about tearing down what's been built, Elijah continued, his voice softer now, more deliberate. It's about building something better. It's about a legacy. Richard Whitman didn't start this company to protect the status quo. He built it to challenge it, and that's exactly what I intend to do. At the mention of Richard, a ripple of acknowledgement moved through the board. Richard's absence loomed large, but so did his trust in Elijah, a trust that even the most resistant voices couldn't ignore. Elijah shifted gears, his tone growing sharper. Let's talk specifics. Over the next 90 days, we'll be restructuring leadership across every department. Some of you in this room may need to step back, reevaluate, and decide if you're willing to adapt. Those who can't or won't will have to make way for those who can. Gasps echoed through the room. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her gaze on Elijah, unwavering in her support. Victor's face reddened, his hands gripping the table's edge, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "That's bold," Victor spat, his voice cracking. "Reckless even. Do you really think you can turn this company upside down without consequences?" Elijah met Victor's glare without blinking. There are always consequences for doing the right thing, but they pale in comparison to the cost of doing nothing. He turned to the rest of the room, letting his words hang in the air. For those of you who believe in this vision, who are willing to work for it, the path forward is clear. We will rebuild Whitman Enterprises into a place where innovation thrives, where employees feel valued, and where leadership is earned, not inherited. For those who don't, there's the door. The tension in the room reached its peak. Some board members exchanged uncertain glances, while others sat frozen, unsure of how to respond. Sarah's gaze darted around the room, searching for signs of support or resistance. Finally, Catherine Moore, the head of marketing, spoke. "Elijah's right," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a beacon. "We've been too comfortable for too long. The changes he's talking about, they're hard, but they're necessary. If we don't adapt, we'll be left behind." Trevor Harding, the finance lead, nodded in agreement. "I've seen the numbers. We can't keep doing what we've always done. Elijah has my support." Elijah felt a wave of relief, but he didn't let it show. He nodded to Catherine and Trevor, then turned back to the rest of the room. "This is the moment. This is our chance to lead, not just as a company, but as individuals. The question is, will you rise to it?" Elijah allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room, watching as his words took root. Slowly, one by one, board members nodded. Some did so reluctantly, their faces tight with unease. Others, like Catherine and Trevor, met Elijah's gaze with newfound determination. Victor, however, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I won't be part of this," he said coldly. "You're risking everything Richard built, and when it all falls apart, don't expect me to clean up the mess." He stormed out, leaving the room in stunned silence. Elijah exhaled slowly, turning back to the remaining board members. "For those of you still here," he said, his voice steady, "thank you. This won't be easy, but I promise you, it will be worth it." As Elijah left the meeting, Sarah caught up with him in the hallway. "That was intense," she said, her voice low. "But I think you got through to them." Elijah gave her a faint smile. Getting through to them was the easy part. Now we have to show them it wasn't just words. As they walked toward the elevator, Elijah felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt the tide turning. The old guard was crumbling, and a new chapter for Whitman Enterprises was finally beginning.